Hello, this is Hot Lunch. This is the 800-pound gorilla of the video production industry, the Sony FS7. Other cameras may get the glamour, but this is the camera that gets the work. 3 years ago, I decided to get into video production, and since then I've been working mostly with DSLRs, from the Canon 5D Mark II to the Panasonic GH5 to the Sony series to my beloved Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K. But really, this is the first time that I have had a sustained chance to look at the Sony FS7, and it's thanks to Camera Kit. This is a completely independent and unpaid review, but they've kindly offered us the camera and accessories that we'll go through in the show today. So this is going to be a review not of a new piece of technology, but of something that really has become a mainstay of the video production industry. Launched in 2014 and updated in 2016, the Sony FS7 has a camera that you'll see everywhere. You'll see it on TV productions, you'll see it at weddings, you'll see it in lots of commercial scenarios, from conferences to advertisements. And it's a camera that has sort of gained this reputation as being solid, reliable, and having a pleasing image. So what we've done is basically try to use it over a variety of scenarios, and really to see how we as DSLR shooters, as people who work daily with video, but not with a beast giant camera like this, fare when given this kind of camera, and how it changes our workflow. So we wanted to do this not just because this is a popular camera, but because we're at the point where we're considering buying new camera gear. And this is a big leap to consider. Coming from a small camera, there are lots of things to take on board. Which family of cameras do you want to go with? Do you want to go for Canon, where there's lots of, in Ireland at least, Canon glass available EF lenses? Do you want to go with Sony, which have great low light performance and have become very popular in recent years? Do you want to try something like a wildcard like Blackmagic? They all offer these large ENG style production cameras, and they all have their own quirks. So in our journey to find the perfect gear for us, maybe we can help you find the perfect gear for you. This is a camera that didn't evolve from small DSLR analog or digital cameras. It's a camera that evolved from studio production cameras, and everything about it is large and designed to be operated quickly. So we're going to look at how it's different from a DSLR camera, what you need to know in order to use it, and what we encountered in terms of problems, difficulties, and benefits from using a camera that was purpose designed and purpose built rather than adapted for video. So what did we borrow? Well, Camera Kit were kind enough to lend us not just the Sony FS7, but a full kit of accessories, starting with this Sachtler Video 18 S2 tripod. And with a big heavy camera like this, you're going to need a real tripod. Your small photography tripods are not going to handle the weight of the camera and all the accessories. So we also have this Hawkwinds V-mount adapter plate, complete with an Enduro Duo 150 148 watt hour V-mount battery. V-mount batteries are incredibly adaptable, and they let you power not just the camera, but also a lot of accessories that come with the camera. And of course, they last much longer than a small native battery like the one you get with the FS7. We also got a lens of this 18 to 110 f4 powered zoom, optically steadied Sony lens. And we also borrowed the full set of Leica Loxia primes. These aren't cinema glass, they're photo primes, but they have that Leica look, that very sharp, contrasty look. So we tried those out on the camera as well. So the FS7, as I mentioned, doesn't come from a lineage of DSLR cameras. It comes from a production environment, and as such, it supports a far greater range of color options that are designed to be used in the TV production pipeline to give you exactly the PAL or the NTSC image in the right color space that a studio requires for post-production or for live broadcast. That can mean that it's a little bit more complicated to use. So there is a sort of built-in easy mode in the camera, and it's called custom. Now, custom does have a lot of options inside it, but basically what it lets you do is shoot while maintaining a burned-in LUT, like let's say Rec 9. This is going to give you a quick, easy to edit image that doesn't have as much leeway in post and doesn't have quite as much dynamic range. But if you're a one-man band, or if you're producing for something to be edited by someone who can't color grade, that's the way you want to go. The other mode in the camera is called Cine EI. Now, Cine EI is very complex and has many options. Broadly speaking, there are two main color spaces that you want to be working with in Cine EI, log 2 and log 3. Alisdair Chapman, who's a Sony Ambasaor, has a really good and deep series of videos, and also quick written guides that you can download from Sony, which cover these in much more detail than I can get into. Suffice it to say, we shot with the camera in a variety of color modes, trying out all the different log profiles to see how they looked in bright light or inside under artificial light, under tungsten light. But this is where we run into some of the awkwardnesses of dealing with a camera that comes from the more complex TV production side, and that's the limitations that the different color modes have. Now really, you only have access to all of the exposure tools you might be used to in the custom mode, and that's the mode that you shouldn't really be using unless you're not going to be doing any post on your image. When you're using log and shooting in the Cine EI mode, you're going to run into some limitations, and they can be frustrating. One of the most obvious is white balance. So rather than being able to set any white balance you like, you're limited to 3 preset white balances that come built in to the Cine EI mode. These are, broadly speaking, tailored for interior and exterior light. And of course, in post you can shift your white balance to some extent, but this is not raw. You can't just arbitrarily change it. So it does limit to some extent what you can do with white balance. More importantly, from an operator's point of view, is the fact that the exposure tools, so like histogram, waveform, vector scope, that kind of thing, can't be seen at the same time as a LUT. So you can't be monitoring exactly what your image is going to look like and also simultaneously seeing an exposure monitor. I mean, that's a pretty big limitation to my eyes. Obviously, a lot of people will be using a camera like this, not only even with an external monitor, maybe even with a full production studio. And in the TV environment, you have people whose dedicated job it is to vision mix and to do color control, possibly even in a separate studio. And of course, this camera does facilitate all of that through external control. The camera also supports 2 main export file formats: XAVC-I for larger and higher quality interframe files, and XAVC-L for long GOP or squeezed down files. These are half the size, but obviously suffer in quality. So you probably want to stick with that XAVC-I format, and especially if you're shooting 4K, but it will eat through these cards. You're not talking a huge amount of recording time on the pretty standard 128 gig cards. In camera, you don't get the ability to shoot RAW or ProRes. Now there is an external accessory that you can purchase for the camera. It's called the XDCA FS7, and it's a brick that goes on the end, which lets you output RAW 12-bit or ProRes files. Short of that though, what you're getting is good, very, very readily gradable 10-bit color, and the images out of the camera are very pleasing. The color is readily manipulatable. You can sharpen quite easily if you're not happy with the sharpness, and you really have a huge amount of control over those log images, not just because they're log images, but because they're in a large file format that's designed to retain a lot of color information. If you're coming from a DSLR, you'll be amazed at how you can grade this footage. One limitation to note: we didn't actually shoot any HD at all, but HD files are only 8-bit, so they're going to be much less gradable. Of course, the 4K files are 10-bit, and as I mentioned, they're a pleasure to grade. This is really very flexible footage, especially if you're coming from, let's say, an A7S II or a camera of that ilk. You're going to be blown away by how much grading power you have, how much you can color and give character to the image before the image breaks down, and also how much you can pull back the highlights or recover the shadows before you get noise and issues like that. This is a camera that loves to be edited. One other thing I want to mention about color before we move on: I ran into a bit of an issue. This is absolutely not the fault of the camera, but Resolve can't read the metadata. Now, this is a production camera, as I mentioned, so it produces a huge amount of metadata. If you're using a Sony lens like this, it tells you what lens it is, what f-stop it was shooting at, it tells you what file format, and very importantly, what kind of log you're shooting in. You're going to need to know that in post, especially if you're grading as you should by using a color space transform. And if you don't know what that is, I'm going to link to a tutorial below. If you are grading like that, you're going to need to know the file format. And that is not something Resolve can tell you. Now, thankfully, Sony do produce their own software. It's called Catalyst Browse, and it will let you look at any files that you shot on the camera, and presumably any other Sony camera, and see exactly what the settings were when you were shooting it. Again, especially those color space settings. Unfortunately, it's kind of slow. It's not the most friendly software, and it only lets you look for one file at a time. You have to scroll down through the metadata. That would be great if Blackmagic would add the ability to read those metadata files. Seems like a no-brainer, but for now, it doesn't seem to be something that it can do. At least I haven't discovered how it can. Okay, so this is the mea culpa, egg on the face section where we admit what we did wrong. So we made a few mistakes renting the camera and using it. Straight out of the box, I love to pick up a camera and just start shooting, just start playing with it, not worry about manuals or anything like that. Maybe, arguably, it's not the best idea. I wouldn't do it on a job, but it's a really good way to learn a camera. And we shot some footage, which I'll roll now, straight away with factory settings. Unfortunately, that was in custom mode, which, as I mentioned earlier, shoots a burned in LUT, and it didn't have any exposure meters turned on by default. So just judging by eye, those first few shots are all blown out. Now, you can see in the footage how much I was able to pull it back. It is recoverable to a surprising extent, but of course, burnt out footage is burnt out footage. It's not a mistake anyone who's familiar with the camera would make, but it's something to be aware of. We also underestimated just how incredibly great V-mount batteries are. Realistically, even if you were shooting something like a wedding where you're going to be shooting all day, I think probably 2 of these batteries would get you through. Now these are, you know, hefty batteries, but they're not the biggest V-mounts by any means. V-mounts come in 3-4 times as large varieties, and also in smaller, easier to carry and more legal to transport. I think around about 90-95 watts is all you can take through an airport. But these 148 watt hour batteries, like I say, 2 of them will get you through a day. 3 of them absolutely get you through any shoot long into the night. But even 1, if you're doing a normal corporate shoot where you're just shooting clips, interviews, talking heads, probably sufficient for a day. That's amazing. Coming from the Blackmagic, oh my God. We asked Camera Kit to give us, I think it was 4 batteries. We only ever used 1. That's fantastic. What we underestimated was really how big the footage was. You know, we're used to shooting RAW. This isn't RAW footage, but it really filled up the cards quickly. We borrowed 4 cards and we found ourselves cycling through them quite quickly, just shooting clips of VT. So if you're going to be shooting, let's say, a wedding or a long day shoot, you're really going to need either a lot of these 128 gig cards or much larger cards. And of course, this is very much like CFast or CFast Express cards. They're very expensive. There's no kind of cheap alternative. You're really going to have to buy the official Sony media, and it is not cheap. When you buy a camera like this, you're not just buying a camera, you're buying into a system, and you're going to need things for it. You're going to need things like mounting rails. You're going to need things like external battery solutions, and you're going to need storage. So be aware when you're renting or buying this camera, storage is something you really need to take on board and estimate beforehand. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the handling of the Sony FS7. So the number one thing that you might notice coming from a DSLR is this thing. You have an EVF or electronic viewfinder. Well, in this case, it's really a monitor and a manual viewfinder. So this is a detachable component. You've got a pretty regular screen like you might have on a A7S, say, but you also have this attachment. And this gives you a superpower. What it lets you do is see in bright light. Anyone who's ever done any kind of videography in regular daylight will know how incredibly difficult it can be to pull focus or even know what you're looking at in really, really bright light. Yes, you can get sun hoods. I have an Atomos monitor, which is rated to 1000 nits, supposed to be very, very bright. But in practice, in bright light, that's still not bright enough. And you end up turning on all sorts of features which make your image look terrible just to be able to see if you're in focus. Not so with something like this. It's a simple little addition, but it's life-changing. And obviously, slapping this on a DSLR, you're going to get rid of most of the benefits of having a small camera. When you got a big shoulder-mounted or tripod-mounted camera like this, absolutely no problem at all to add on something small or something big. And having a viewfinder, when we were out shooting the sun, changed everything. I remember shooting Paul was shooting me. Both times, the other person found it very difficult to know whether their subject was in focus. Meanwhile, we were shooting nature, shooting birds, no problem on the bigger camera, all thanks to the viewfinder. And that is something that comes with the camera, as does this handle, this handpiece, this zoom assembly, if you will. It lets you control a powered lens like this one, and it also lets you push in to critical focus. And critical focus is when you zoom right into a subject to make sure that they're tack sharp. Having that functionality at your hand, and of course having a record button and menu control as well that you can pop into the menu without having to take your eye away from the eyepiece while you're shooting, is incredibly useful, especially critical focus. But The reason that that is so useful is because this monitor, unlike the eyepiece, is not the best. It's a low resolution monitor, and I personally found it incredibly difficult at times to ensure a subject, especially a distant subject, was in focus. Again, especially using this lens. And this is an f4 lens. It's a very nice lens, but the optics aren't as precise, obviously, as a prime because it has such a long zoom range. So when I was at the limits of the zoom range and we shot our friends Chris and Anya performing across the water in a harbour, maintaining social isolation as we did so, it was really, really hard to see if it was in focus. There is a little indicator on the monitor, which, similar to Canon, is supposed to let you know whether the subject is precisely in focus. But that indicator is analog, it goes up and down, it doesn't give you a fixed measure. This is focused, this is not focused. And I didn't feel like it was reliable. So pushing into critical focus was very, very useful. This camera also has a push autofocus. That's something you'll find on the Panasonics as well. And it's an underused feature. I think a lot of shooters don't even realize it's there. Many video cameras, especially DSLRs that have really, really bad autofocus, have this amazing ability to push in and get really, really accurate focus. It's not something you're going to be using while you're shooting, but prior to a shot, to nail that focus, especially when the subject is large in the frame, especially when you're shooting 4K or 6K or 8K, push to focus is a lifesaver. It can do what you'll have to spend much more time doing with critical focus using the monitor. This is also obviously a camera which is rich in external buttons and menus. So while the menu system, which I'll get to, can be confounding, the external buttons are a lifesaver. Pretty much any function that you wish can be mapped to the custom function buttons which stud the camera. You also have dedicated controls for your two major audio channels on the camera, and this can be set to auto if you just don't have the time, but you can manually set them. So something else that you have on this camera that's incredibly useful and can be controlled from this array of buttons is variable ND. You also, on a lens like this, have iris control, and you switch between them with a little switch, so you only control one at a time. But on a conventional camera, like the DSLRs that we're used to, you might slap a variable ND filter, like a physical wheel, on the front of the camera. The one that I use, which is a Tiffin variable ND, has a great reputation, but I find it incredibly obnoxious and annoying to use. When you really are out in the bright sun and you're pulling your variable ND filter to darken it down to get the correct exposure, on many NDs, including the one that I own, you can easily drift into a smudge of blue that ruins the image, and you might not even be able to tell, especially on a bright day when you need it most. Sony have built in a variable electronic ND, and it's really pretty revolutionary. And it's revolutionary because it lets you do something incredibly important. It lets you change ND, not in slots, like putting in new NDs on the front of a lens, or let's say with a Canon or even an Arri mirror, slotting in various internal NDs. What this has is a variable electronic ND. So there's only one ND filter in the camera, and you're really only, when you use this ND filter switch, you're only switching between no ND and having the ND. But what you can also do is electronically vary how strong the ND is. You can set the settings on the ND switch to your own custom ND measures, or you can use the variable ND knob to nail in precisely that ND level that you want, and that will let you change on the fly how dark your image is without messing with your aperture, or past where you want to put your aperture to, because maybe you don't want to have your aperture at 16 because we had a soft image, and you can then really losslessly use this ND to nail image. What the variable electronic ND lets you do is move from outside to inside while maintaining your level of exposure. It lets you turn towards the sun while retaining your level of exposure. It lets you shift from a bright subject backlit to a frontlit subject, and all the time have very fine grained control and be sure that you're maintaining exposure, you're not blowing out your highlights, or you're not underexposing your image. Unfortunately, it does have a really, really major and significant limitation. The most useful way to use this feature is automatically, and that's something that you can only do in custom mode. So when you're out shooting in log, you're shooting Cine EI, you can't have the variable exposure automatically compensate for changes in light, which would be tremendously useful and wouldn't really require something like autofocus in terms of complexity for the brain of the camera to handle. It's just measuring the exposure level. It should be something that's possible, but again, it's one of those quirky little limitations that the camera has. Two other things to mention. People often talk about how heavy cameras are more stable, and yes, it's true. When you have a very heavy camera, it's obviously going to be much more stable than a small DSLR. But I was surprised to find that shoulder mounted, this camera had a lot less stability, certainly to a new, naive shoulder mount operator like myself, than I would have expected. The shoulder shots that I thought were rock solid often weren't, and while I was able to maintain relatively calm camera movement while tracking an animal, say like a bird, when focusing on a person or a distant object, especially at the extended 110 range of this lens, I did have issues with stability. Now again, you can't expect miracles. There is built-in stabilization in the lens, and of course there's none in the camera. Just like the Blackmagic camera, it doesn't have IBIS or anything like that, or even electronic stabilization like some of the Canon cameras. But I would have expected a little bit more from the sheer weight. One other issue, of course, is that this is, to my mind, quite an expensive lens. This zoom lens retails for close enough to €3,000. And for that money, you do get this great zoom range, and it's relatively not precisely parafocal, but it maintains focus quite well. But I found the zoom itself quite jittery. Starting off and finishing a zoom was really more glitchy than I would have wanted. And even with changing the zoom settings in the camera, I wasn't able to get a smooth zoom ramp. Now you do have variable degrees of zoom speed, which you're adjusting through these analog switches, but they really were quite sort of rough. I didn't really feel like I had full control of how fast it was going to zoom, or how, more importantly, how easily it eased into zooming. So the beginning of zooms were a little bit jerky. Coming from the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, which has arguably got the best menu system on any camera, to the Sony FS7, which famously has one of the worst menu systems on any camera, is a bit of a shocker. That said, the menu doesn't have to be that puzzling for a run and gun shooter. Going into the user menu gives you access to user-defined settings. In other words, you can decide what settings you'd like to sit in this menu. By default, it's got some very useful settings, including base setting, where you tell the camera what mode to record in. This is where you'll decide between custom mode with its built-in LUTs and Cine EI, and whether you'd like to shoot in S-Log 2, which may hold highlights better for very brightly lit situations, S-Gamut 3, S-Log 3, or S-Gamut 3, S-Log 3.cine. You're also going to decide recording format and codec here. We've got it set to 4K UHD 25p and XAVC-I, which is the highest quality codec available on the camera. You also have options for things like S&Q, which is Sony's somewhat confusing label for slow motion. So here it's set to 60 frames a second. And it's important to remember that if you're shooting in Europe or in the UK, you'll want to have that at 50p or 50 frames a second if you're shooting inside and want to avoid flicker from our 60 Hz lights. Overall though, I have to say the menu system is unnecessarily confusing. And part of the reason for that is, as I mentioned, it's set up for a studio environment. So you have many more options, especially when it comes to color, than you might ever need as a solo operator. And it's here in the VF settings, that's the viewfinder menu, that you'll find all of the monitoring settings like peaking, zebra and waveform that you might like to use to ensure you're in focus and properly exposed. One thing to note is that the video signal monitoring menu only allows you to enable one exposure tool at a time. You can have waveform, vector or histogram, but you can't, for example, simultaneously display a histogram and a waveform monitor. You can, of course, save your preferred settings to the camera's included. You can, of course, save your preferred settings to the camera's included SD card slot, which will let you bring your preferred button and color setup between cameras when you use a rental FS7, which can be very useful even if you own your own unit, if you're shooting abroad and want to avoid paying a Carnet custom fee, which of course can be considerable. So, building the camera. When you get this camera out of the box or out of the rental house, it's just going to have a variety of separate pieces and they have to be put together. It's a little bit more involved than turning on a DSLR and slapping on a lens. You do have to assemble and apply your camera mount. In this case, camera kits supply a camera mount which is already screwed into the camera body itself. But you're going to have to add in your external battery. You're going to have to put the camera on the stand. Now this is a multi-part stand. What we have is a V-mount locking stand adapter. We have the adapter itself screws into the camera stand. and the camera quite satisfyingly locks right in. You also have a locking E-mount lens. Now, this is the kind of big brother to the E-mounts that you might be familiar with from the Sony A7 series of cameras, and I found it a nightmare. Every time I put a lens on, it had to be placed exactly dot to dot, held back firmly, and the lock turned. I was never quite sure I was doing it right. I was always terrified that I was going to scratch either the lens itself or worse, the sensor assembly in the camera. This is something, of course, you could get used to. It's something that with time would become second nature, but it felt a bit more fraught than it should have. And coming from EF or Micro Four Thirds mounts, I did not feel comfortable. Now, I know these kinds of locking mounts are something that the film industry has as standard. PL mounts work in a very similar way, but film sets are manned by crews of dozens, if not hundreds of people, and camera assistants are ubiquitous. Not necessarily true for the single shooter doing corporate work or other work, and it's definitely something that I would have to get used to. So let's talk a little bit about what we shot. We were very careful to maintain social distancing in this time of COVID-19, so that did limit us. We didn't have a job per se, which is regrettable because that's the best way to test any camera, on a paid job where you can't mess it up. But we tried to shoot in a variety of different circumstances. I filmed my girlfriend Nicole in our back garden and on our daily exercise walk. We filmed a socially isolated mini gig from our friends playing across a harbour, and we filmed inside and outside, both under tungsten light and natural light, just to get an idea of what the camera is capable of. We were really careful to ensure social distancing while filming. That's why Paul isn't on camera today. He's shooting and at a safe distance from myself. So obviously that makes a review more difficult. But just to restate, this isn't a conventional review. We've gone through some of our impressions of the camera. Yours will be different. There are much more technical reviews available. We're just talking about it from the point of view of DSLR shooters who work professionally with video and are considering camera purchase. But I will say that this is a camera that is worth trying out. And if you want to rent it, Camera Kit in Ireland is a great local way of doing that. And they'll supply you with a great deal and can give you all the accessories included, and more importantly, tell you what you might need for your individual production. As to whether I'd recommend you use the camera, I'm gonna have to say yes. This is such a respected camera that having the skill set, knowing how to use it, is in itself a valuable addition to your toolkit as a camera operative, as a sole shooter. And it's impressive. Turning up to a client with a big camera is always going to blow them away. Unfortunately, that's the case. You might have a more recent and in many ways better spec camera, but the FS7 will be taken more seriously. So it's a useful skill set to have. It's a good camera to use for weddings, for corporate, for short films and music videos. And it really does have a pleasing image. Learning the color science is a hill that I'm glad I got over, and really understanding the capabilities of the camera to some extent is something that I'm really glad I have under the belt. So I'd recommend you rent it and learn it, even if not for a job, because whether it be this camera or a future member of the Sony family like the FX9 that we'll be taking a look at soon, you will at some point very likely have in your hands a camera like this. So learning how to use it is probably something you should do if you can.